Hi guys, and welcome along to another live Vatsim tutorial stream. This is centered on a flight from where we are now on the ground at Washington, Dulles International, and we're going, it's a fictitious route. Well, it's not a fictitious route, there's a couple of airlines that do it, it's not it's a fictitious Delta route from here to Toronto. We've got a couple of controllers online. We did have Tower here. I think we've still got Tower here online. Approacher online at Toronto. So hopefully we should get a bit of coverage on the way. You can see here on the ground here we've got the PMDG 737. I'm going to try not to centre this too much about the aircraft, make it more about the Vatsim procedures. So it's less of a PMDG tutorial. So hopefully people who are flying different aircraft can still get something out of it. Obviously there'll be stuff that's sort of procedure and aircraft specific, so I'm afraid if you're flying a different aircraft you'll just have to sort of put up with the fact that I'll be doing something slightly differently to you, but that's the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So with that in mind, just looking back to a couple of videos I did previously talking about the different bits of software that I've got running to make the sim work. So we've obviously got the sim, which we're in is P3D, we're in version 4, the latest version 4.3 I think, and whatever add-on and aircraft and scenery of your choice. Obviously other sims are available, and most of this should be relevant to whatever sim you're flying. The next thing you need is a decent weather engine. I know there's different options out there depending on what sim you're flying. We've got Active Sky running in the background, putting all the nice live weather into the sim. We need some flight planning. I'm using Sim Brief, which is a browser-based free planning software. Pretty accurate, generates nice little operational flight plan. And using the nice free bit of software that downloads the flight plan for you and puts it in the right folders, it means that there's but 2 or 3 clicks to get the flight plan from the web browser actually into the FMC in the aircraft, again depending on which type of aircraft you've got. So that makes things nice and easy rather than having to type it out by hand every time. Connecting to the Vatsim network, we've got vPilot. Again, other interfaces are available. vPilot's a nice, really easy one to use. It's all fairly self-explanatory. And lastly, we've got Navigraph charts running for all the airport and en route charts. I would highly recommend some form of charts if you're going to be flying on Vatsim, because you really need to be seeing what you're doing, especially when you are given taxi instructions and stuff like that, departure routings, because you're going to need to stick to them, or you're going to risk upsetting some controllers. So with that in mind, let's see if we can complete a successful, albeit fictitious, Delta flight from Dulles to Toronto. So let's jump into the aircraft. So the first thing we're looking at, we've already done a bit of pre-flight in the aircraft. I've got panel states saved so that I don't have to load up from cold and dark every time. It's entirely up to you how you want to go about doing that. And that is something that's unique to each aircraft, so I won't sort of get into too much detail about that. But we're going to need to start setting up the FMC, which we're doing down here. So we're departing from, we were using a reference initially to do the position, make sure the aircraft knows where it is, and that would be our departure airport. We're at Washington Dulles, and we're using a 4-letter code to put that into the FMC. That's the ICAO code for the airport. There's 3-letter codes from IATA, which is for the states is usually the last 3 letters there, IAD for Dulles, and the ICAO code is a 4-letter code, which just has usually a country identifier on the front, so it's K for most of the United States. So you can find those easily enough on Google and Wikipedia and stuff like that. If you just literally search the departure airport with the airport you're looking for and ICAO code, and it will come up with a whole host of different returns on that. So you're always looking for that 4-letter code for your airport, so that is where we're starting from, and that just tells the aircraft where it's starting from in the world, that lat long position. So that means it knows where it's going to next. So next we're going to pop the route in first of all. I'm not going to go too much further with the FMC setup until we've spoken to air traffic control, because you may plan for something and they may change it. So it's always best to just do a little bit, get it started. And we're going to Toronto, so that's Charlie Yankee Yankee Zulu is Toronto, and just because of the way I've got this set up in the PMDG and using the SimBrief downloader, I can put in the code for the flight plan, pop it in the company route box, and it should automatically populate everything for me, so that's cool. You may, if you're using a different aircraft or whatever, you might actually have to physically go and fill in these boxes manually, and then go into the next page and start filling out the route, but for me it's nice and easy that way. And the last thing we just pop in there is the flight number, which is Delta 1485, which is as far as I'm aware, a fictitious flight number. It may be the completely incorrect flight number, and that might be for another route, but that's what we're going with for today. And then we can activate that route, and the execute light pops up, and we'll just hold on the execution of that until we've spoken to air traffic. So I'll just drag across quickly the flight plan using SimBrief. As I say, it's browser based, you just sign up for that and then you can log in, and there's a whole host of good stuff on there, and it's pretty accurate most of the time. So I'll just quickly go to the first page you'll come up with for generating a flight plan. You put all the information into here, the flight number, which we've said is Delta 1485, departure and arrival, airports using the ICAO codes, and the aircraft type, and it will populate the rest for you. You can get into all this other good stuff down here, the number of passengers on board, and investigating the routing a bit further. If you want to make little changes, you can open a route editor down here and do all sorts of stuff. The basics that you need to do are the flight info, the aircraft type, and it will populate the rest for you. Once it's done that, you'd hit generate OFP, generate operational flight plan, and it will bring you up a briefing package. And just check through the summary, make sure everything is correct in there, the routing that it's offered you, and then if you actually scroll down, this is the flight plan. There's pages upon pages of information there. Most of it we're not going to be referencing, a few bits we will be, so we'll just come back to those in a minute. So we've done that, we've generated the OFP and we've got that on a browser, and then we've connected to Vatsim using vPilot or whatever client you want to use. So we're just in the connection box. In fact, I'll show you. Just pop in the aircraft call sign, the aircraft type code, which the aircraft type code you will find when you're selecting in SimBrief, when you're selecting the aircraft type, when you're generating the flight plan. They're all there, all the different types, loads and loads of them. So we're flying as a 737-800, and the aircraft type code is that one that's attached to it. So for a 737-800 series, it's a Boeing 738 B738. So that's the type code. That is what actually goes into vPilot when you are connecting. So the controllers know what type of aircraft you are. So then we just hit connect. That should get us onto the network, and instantly you'll see controllers becoming available that are in range on the left hand side. And then we just go to the flight plan, and then we just fill out the boxes, and all of this information is on the flight plan. So we just need to copy all that across: the departure, the destination, the alternate, which will be given to you. The departure time is always in Zulu, doesn't matter where you are in the world, it's in UTC time, so those times will be always the same wherever you are in the world. Time en route and the amount of fuel available, that's just for planning and for emergencies. If you suddenly disappeared off scope, they know how far you might get on the fuel you've got. The projected or the requested cruise flight level, and then your routing. So the routing is from the flight plan, this section here. In Europe, actually, or certainly in the UK, we don't actually include the first and last bit, which is the SID and the star, the published instrument departure and the instrument arrival at the other end. We can do in the States, and nine times out of 10 they will try and give you what you have filed So we'll include that in the flight plan that we're filing. So we just copy the whole lot. You can, if you want to, just omit the first and the last ones and just copy that, which is the actual routing. So that's your first fix, your en route fixes, and your last fix. But as I say, in the States we can file the whole lot with the procedures as well. So we just copy that, and then in the route box here we would just paste it in. We're not a heavy aircraft, that is your wake turbulence category, so in the 737 we're not a heavy, so we'd leave that out. And then if it's your first time on Vatsim, I would suggest you just pop something in the remarks. That just tells them that I can send and receive voice. And you might just say first time, new user, learning, whatever. Just something to let them know that you might be a little bit slower on the uptake, and 9 times out of 10 if you do that and give them a heads up, they're really cool about it and they'll go out of their way to help you. And then you just hit file flight plan, and that comes up with flight plan filed, all being well. So then you can just leave that running in the background. I always keep it on a second monitor, and I'll talk to you about text in the air when we get up in the air, because sometimes you'll get text messages come through. So if you keep that up where you can see it, then it's always really handy, because if someone texts you, then you'll see it pop up and you'll be able to just drop in there and read it. So with that in mind, we're holding on the actual execution of the flight plan, and we're going to go down there and get the weather information. There's an ATIS available, an automated terminal information service, and there's two ways we can do that. We can type in the frequency or dial in the frequency in COM1, make it active and listen to it, or actually, which is really handy in vPilot and presumably in the other clients as well, if you double click on any of these positions, it will give you the ATIS by text, and all of these positions, the ATIS, that actual ATIS is the weather for the airfield. If we double click on tower, it should give you his comments. So he's not got anything particularly important in there. It's worth checking those out, because you might have a NOTAM or something, some piece of not useful information in there that you didn't know about, restrictions and so on. So it's always worth just checking that. So I'll just hold on the actual text then before we go and listen to it. So we've got information hotel, and they're always given a letter designator, so we need to note that down. And write it down. I always keep a laptop next to me for notes and stuff. So information hotel is the current information. Wind 190 at 6 knots, and I always just compare that to active sky, which I've got running in the background, just to make sure that the wind that they're expecting is the wind that I've got in the sim, so it's all accurate and it all ties up together. So just take a quick little moment to look at that. So it's 190 at 6. And we'll just look at the pressure 1018 or 30.07. I'll come back to what that means in a minute, but just to confirm that those figures are the same, 3007, they are. So the weather is accurate, and it's always worth just making sure that what you've got in your sim is what they have on Vatsim, because otherwise they can give you vastly different runways to what you're expecting, and it can all go horribly wrong. So we've got the weather in text, but we'll actually go and listen to it as well. So it's on 134.850, and our next frequency will be over the tower to actually call for clearance on 120.1. So I'll pop in 120.1 first, and I'll show you why that makes sense in a second. Just make it active, so we type it on the standby side and then hit the transfer switch, it goes active and you'll hear that connect. And then if we dial in 134.85, 134.85, and then when we swap across, listen to the ATIS, and then when we're ready we can just swap back.
Temperature 32, 3.21, altimeter 3007. Arrivals expect ILS for visual runway 19 center, runway 19 right, departing runway 30. Simultaneous reports are being conducted to power runways. Routes of determined. Please make all runway assignments and hold serve instructions. Operating row 3 on the taxiway and runway. Right.
Okay, so we have got the information and we've just confirmed that it is indeed Information Hotel. The temperature was 31 degrees, it's nice and warm here today. The QNH, the altimeter settings are 3007 and the departure runway will be runway 30. So with that in mind, then we need to compose our call to it'll be Tower today, because that's the next available station online. We need to compose our call to them for our clearance. So at this point it's just worth making sure you have an idea of what to expect, because if you I'm just going to open the charts up as well so I can show you. If you have an idea of what they're going to say to you, then it makes anticipating that call and then your response a lot easier than trying to sort of guess what they're saying as they're saying it. So we're going to ask them, we're going to call them up with who we are, where we are, and what we want. So we are Delta 1485 on Gate Bravo 74 here at Dulles, and we're with Information Hotel. So that's why it's important to note down the information you've got. Information Hotel, and the altimeter setting QNH is 3007, and that tells them that you definitely got the latest weather, and then request clearance to Toronto and they should come back with a clearance. So we'll see how that goes. So we are anticipating from the flight plan, because remember we had at the start of the flight plan the departure, the Jerez 2, or Jerez 2, depending on how you want to pronounce it, to Jerez, to the first fix. So that is the standard instrument departure procedure that links our departure runway to our first waypoint. And that is a published procedure which will be in the charts. So if we bring the charts across and have a quick look at that, just before we call them up. So these are the charts for Washington, and if we look down the Jerez 2 RNAV departure, I'll just check on that and have a look, and it is, if we roll that in there, we're expecting a runway 30 for departure, so it'll be off of 30 on a heading of 301 to 820 feet, and then a right turn to 320, and then presumably, if we check up here, and then vectors. So yeah, it'll be vectors from. It would be approach, but I don't think there's approach online at the moment. But we'll cover that when we come to it. So that's what we're expecting. It's always worth mentioning that for whatever operational reasons, control may well turn around and issue you something else. So just bear that in mind when you make your call. Just be open-minded and write everything down, and you can always question them there. If you write it down, you've got something to reference, and then you can question them on it if you're not sure. So with that in mind, we will make sure we are tuned to Tower, and we'll go across and give them a call with that format, who you are, where you are, and what you want, and see what the response is. Those targeting Delta 1485 with Gate Bravo 74, Information Hotel, altimeter is 3007, request IFR clearance to Toronto.
Delta 1485, Delta Tower, thank you for hotel. You're cleared to the Toronto airport via the Jerez 2 departure. Jerez transition then is filed. Maintain 3000. Expect flight level 27010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is offline. Monitor Unicom 122.8, Fox 5656.
Clear to Toronto, the Jerez 2, departure runway 30, initial climb 5000, expecting 2701 minutes after departure. Departures Unicom 122.8 and squawking 5656, Delta 1485.
Delta 1485, route back is correct. Push to start is at your discretion. Expect runway 30 for departure. Call ready for taxi.
Push start when ready, and we'll call you for taxi, Delta 1485. Thank you. Okay, so What was all that about? That came thick and fast. So he's cleared us on the Jerez 2 departure, which is what we expected. He's cleared us 3,000 feet initially, and then expect cleared cruise level of flight level 270 within 10 minutes after departure. There's no departures online, so he's told us that after departure we can expect to go over to Unicom on 122.8. And then squawking 5656, which is our transponder code, which goes in the box down here, and that allows, it's a unique code that's given to each departing flight, and it allows them to track us on secondary surveillance radar, and by using the transponder mode switch, we can pop it in a mode where it transmits our height and speed information on SSR, so they can see where we are, where we're going, what we're doing on radar. So that transponder code is very important, so you make sure you write that down, pop that straight in the box so you don't forget, and then part of the procedure of pushing back and starting up will be to make sure that that is on the correct mode, ready for departure. So we can finish off then the pre-flight. If we go over to here, we got the departure we were expecting, so we can pop that in the box. Runway 30 for departure, and the Jerez 2. We just make sure we're in Dulles departures page. The SID, the standard instrument departure, is the one we've cleared for. The Jerez 2 selected, runway 30 selected, and then if we go back to the routes page, that should come up as execute. We can execute that. And if you just look up here, you've got the 1/2, 1 out of 2 pages. So if we just next page across, we can just see that routing. The Jerez 2 to Jerez, airway Juliet 220 to Sierra Foxtrot Kilo VOR, direct to Wazzy, and then it will be an arrival into Toronto. There's no discontinuities, no gaps or anything broken in there, so we can accept that routing. And what I would do also is, at this point, especially on a nice short flight like this, if we just grab the weather for the arrival and pop in the arrival we're expecting as well, so it's 140 at 4 is the wind, so we're expecting from the flight plan an arrival of the Ling 8 there. So all we need to do just for now, bearing in mind the winds are from 140, just go to the arrivals page for Toronto. So we can expect an ILS of either the 15 left or right as the winds are 140. So I would anticipate a 15 left. So just pop that in and see if we've got a Wazzy arrival. We don't have a Wazzy arrival for that one, so if we just erase that and go to 15 right, see if we've got a Wazzy for that one. We don't have. Okay, interesting. So we'll erase that. Well, there is no. Sorry, that's a lie. That's a complete lie, because Wazzy's the last fix on my flight plan. It's the Ling 8 arrival I'm looking for. It does help if you read your flight plan. 15 pages of arrivals there, we'll go that way. Okay, so we'll anticipate 15 left and the Ling 8, there we go. So just pop that in now with a Wazzy transition, there we are, that's the fix I was looking for. And this is literally just so that the FMC has all the information, as much information as you can give it, to plan your top of descent point accurately, because what you don't want to do is get into the air, especially on a short flight, then pop all this information in and it goes, you should have started descending 5 minutes ago. So if we just pop it in now, we can always change it, it's always subject to change, but it just goes in before departure, and then you've given it as much information as you possibly can. So we need to set the next thing will be the takeoff performance. What I'm going to do is go ahead and just get GSX boarding us some passengers while we're doing that. Because I'm running GSX as well at the same time, so we've already got our catering on board, and then we can start boarding some passengers. There we go. So while they're boarding, then we need to finish off the planning. So we need to do some performance planning for our takeoff. So before you guys came along, before I started the stream, I just loaded the fuel and the payload into the aircraft. Now this is specific to each type of aircraft. It may be totally different for your type of aircraft, so I won't bore you with the details on this one. Obviously with the PMDG it's through the FMC here. Some aircraft have, some add-ons have an external bit of software that runs outside of the sim. But you just need to make sure you've got the trip fuel, which you can find in the flight plan at the top of the summary section, and the zero fuel weight or the payload. Make sure you've got the relevant load in so that it's heavy, as heavy, and the centre of gravity is where it's expecting to be. And then you need to know from the flight plan your zero fuel weight, which will be in the summary box there. It'll also be on the plan in the weights section down here. Zero fuel weight, 60.9 tonnes for us today, because that is integral to the performance planning. So with that in mind, zero fuel weight 60.8 tonnes goes into here, the zero fuel weights box. From the flight plan again, we need the FINRES, or the final reserves figure, which you can find just under this line here with the dispatcher and the pilot in command, the signature box, where that would be signed off from the dispatcher to the pilot in command when he's happy. Underneath there, the FINRES, 2.5 tonnes all bar. So 2.5 tonnes of fuel is our reserve amount. That's the minimum we must arrive with at the other end. Cost index, I would suggest you go and look up all about cost indexes, because they are a very wide and varied entity. Basically what it does is it tells the FMC to plan either for a slightly faster and higher fuel burn, or slightly lower and slightly slower and lower fuel burn. It's all about economy, so the higher the cost index, the less economical the flight, but the faster you get there, give or take. So airlines operate to different cost indexes depending on who they are, what routing they're on, and so on, what aircraft it is. So I think I'm right in saying that Delta operate on a cost index of 45 for the domestic routes. I'm not entirely convinced, but it's kind of up to you what you put in there, really. Ryanair, I think, operate on something like an 18, and some of the international flights, transatlantics and so on, operate on like a 100 or an 80. So it's up to you. We go for a middle of the road there on 45. The cruise level we filed for 270, and we're clear for 270, so that can go into the box. Cruise wind, some aircraft you don't have to put this in. In the PMDG you do. Oh, she's back again, lovely. In the flight plan, if we go down past the weight section, past the nav log, which is all the individual legs, and down to the wind information, and then there's wind for each waypoint and the top of climb and descent phases. So we're looking for a wind of 270, and we want this information here. 257 at 21 is the wind speed and direction. Minus 25 is the forecast temperature for that flight level. So that's the bit we're looking for at our planned flight level. GSX is whinging at me to close the doors, so we'll do that now. So we want a wind of 257 at 21. 257, it goes exactly as it's written in there. The forward slash makes it separates the two figures: wind speed, wind direction, and wind speed. And then this section here, the ISO deviation, this isn't really relevant to some of the aircraft because you don't put this in. All that means is the difference between the standard temperature, standard atmospheric temperature at that flight level, and the forecast. And at the moment, there's a 13-degree difference between the standard and what is actually forecast today. It's 13 degrees warmer, which is the deviation. So it's a deviation of 13 degrees between standard and what is actually forecast today. So we pop the difference in there. That should make that minus 25, which is what is forecast. If the difference was colder, we just put a minus figure in there to whatever the difference is. Lastly, the transition altitude. If we go to the charts, we should find, if we bring up the right chart here, and we have a look down here. The transition altitude is 18,000 feet. That's pretty much standard across the US. 18,000 feet is what goes into there, and that will become apparent when we get in the air. That's the point, the level at which we change from our altimeter setting to a standard, and I'll talk about that once we're in the air. So, all being well, we should now have a gross weight figure in there, which we need to know in a second, and we can execute that. What you guys choose to plan your takeoff performance with is kind of up to you. There's a few different things out there. Top Cap being one of the most, I think one of the most popular ones still. I'm using this thing called Topper. There's a 737, a 777 and a 787 variant. It seems to work well for me. I'm only interested really in one figure, which will come up at the bottom here. That's the selected temperature. Just make sure you got the right variant in there and you're in the right weights. We're using metric kilograms today. And this is how it works. We pop in the departure airport and the runway we're expecting, runway 30, wet or dry, and we can look at active sky today and see that it is dry. We need to get the wind information as well, because that is very relevant to our departure. I'm just looking for where active sky has disappeared to. There she is. Okay, so the wind today is 190 at 6. At 6, that goes in there. The outside air temperature is 31 degrees, so that will reduce the effective performance of the engines, because the hotter it is, the less dense the air is. And 1018 is the current altimeter QNH. In the States, it's done on inches of mercury, which is this figure, 3007, or 1018 is hectopascals. They're just two different ways of doing the same thing. The States and some parts of the Far East use inches of mercury, so 3007 will be what we're actually talking about when we're talking to air traffic control over here, but for the sake of the planning and in other parts of the world you'd use that figure there. They're much the same thing, and we'll show you how that works in a second. So 1018 is the QNH. Flaps for takeoff will be flaps 5, the air conditioning will be on, the anti-ice will be off, and the takeoff weight, which is that figure, the gross weight there, 67 tons, 67,000 kilos, and calculate that and we should get a figure down here. Lovely. So Washington Dulles, runway 30, flaps 5 departure, selected temperature of 67 degrees. And that is what we're looking for, that temperature there. And what that means in terms of the Boeing, it's totally different for the Airbus. So again, this is one of those things that's not going to be relevant to everybody. But for the Boeing, we need the selected temperature, which goes into here in the M1 limit box. And what that means is at the moment our engines can produce 21,000 pounds of thrust at maximum setting, and the maximum N1 value is 101%. If we pop 67 degrees into the selected temperature, watch what happens to that figure. It is reduced. What that means is the performance will be set as if the outside air temperature was in fact 67 and not 31 degrees. And therefore the performance is reduced, so there's less stress on the engine, less fuel burn, less environmental impact, noise and stuff like that. And all carriers will operate on a reduced takeoff M1 limit where they can. And it's just a different config for the Airbus. So just try and learn if you can about how that applies to your particular aircraft. If not, you can leave it blank and just have a full power takeoff. But you'll, especially if you're light and the runway's long, you'll be eating up a lot of tarmac very quickly, and you'll get off the ground way quicker than you need to. So just try and operate to a derated takeoff if you can. So that's that page done. Flaps 5 we planned for, so that can go into the flaps selection there. PMDG offers you a really nice feature there. You double tap on the C of G, it will pop it in for you automatically, and then the trim is our elevated trim. That's a figure we need to just look at in a second, and then our V speeds we can just by clicking on the box, and they go across into the active side there. The trim of 4.67 units is our elevator trim, which is just down here next to the thrust levers there. And that is the little scale we're looking at. It's this wheel here, or you can set it to buttons on your yoke or your joystick, whatever you're using, and we just use that to set the elevator trim for takeoff. It'll be somewhere between the 4 and 5, about there, 4.67. So that little noise there was just Tower telling me, he just dropped us a message to say he'll be right back, so he's obviously gone for a coffee quickly. So yeah, we've set the trim, which it just means that when we rotate and set our climb attitude after departure, all being well, if that's trimmed correctly, we shouldn't need any pressure on the controls. We can release those and it will hold the trim for us. Awesome. So we are very nearly there. There's a lot to this, I realise, and some of it will be relevant, some of it won't be, but we're almost there. The last thing we need to do is just configure the MCP, which is the autopilot control panel on the top there. And the first thing we need to look at is this figure here, which will be our V2 speed. That is the speed we're going to set in the window up here. So 146 goes into there, and that's our V2 speed. That's the safe climb speed after departure. We then need the runway heading, which we'll dial in after departure for flying immediately after departure, which if we look at the charts is 301, so that goes into this box here. We'll just roll that way. It's quicker. Down to 301 degrees, and we were cleared to initially 3,000 feet. So that goes into there. So that's our first stop altitude. So then we can say the MCP is loaded. So we're very nearly at the point where we can actually start looking at checklists and getting the aircraft ready. Obviously, this would all happen a lot quicker, as you wouldn't be sort of talking through it as you're doing it. So by now the passengers are probably getting pretty frustrated, but hey ho, they will live with it. So the last pre-flight, pre-pushback checks we can do: make sure the MCP is loaded, turn the flight directors on, make sure the QNH is set. It's changed since we set it, so it's now 1018, and that just calibrates the altimeter there. And in fact, as I said, we're in the States, so that should be in inches of mercury, 3006. There we go. I lie, 3007 is what is currently forecast on Active Sky there. That's the figure we're looking at. Cool, so I'm using, from one of my previous tutorial videos, you'll know all about the checklists. There's many wide varied selections of checklists for different types of aircraft. So I'm just going to follow the it's the Fly UK. I think they're a virtual airline that have a load of checklists up there for some of the Boeings, so that's really handy. It's pretty comprehensive. So I will just complete the pre-departure flow and then run the checklist and get us underway. So starting the APU, so at the moment we're on ground power, so we need the aircraft to provide its own electrical power, so we start the APU for that, and then just from the top we go yaw damper on, fuel pumps can come on, nothing in the centre, so those tanks can stay off. This section we don't really use apart from to confirm the cabin utility and the seats are on. The standby power is set, but currently the drive lights are illuminated because we've got no engines running. That's as we would expect. Bus transfer switches we'll come to in a second. The equipment cooling is normal, the emergency lights are armed, the guard is closed. Refueling is completed, so the seatbelt signs are on. The window heat's on, the probe heats are off. The hydraulics actually would have been on for the pilot monitoring to do the walk round, because the electric pump's pressurised, and then you'll see if there's any leaks, so they would have actually been on by now. Trim air switch can go on, the packs are auto, the isolation valve is open, and all the bleeds are on. And finally the cruise level flight level 270 is set. The APU has just become available, so this light's now come on there just to tell us that there is power available, but it's not actually currently connected. So if we just toggle those sprung loaded switches, the light goes out, and we can say the APU is on bus, the bus transfers are in, and the APU is now supplying air and electrics. So we can go down to here, go to the ground connections and get rid of all the ground connections, and we're now totally self-sufficient. Parking brake is set, and we can run the checklist. So you do all the flow first and then run the checklist afterwards, and then just verify against the checklist that everything's been done. So the parking brake is set, the battery's on, guard closed, the standby power guard's closed, centre fuel pump's not required, the APU is on, position lights on, logo lights not required, cabin lighting we'll assume that's being controlled by the flight attendants. Emergency exit lights are armed, guards closed, the passenger signs are on, packs are on auto, the RS mode selectors are on nav, the FMC is loaded. And below the line the clearance is received, the transponder is set, the MCP is set 146, 301 and 3000 feet. The yaw damper is on, the window heats are on, the flight altitude is set to 70 on the overhead panel. That's the pressurization panel. The flight directors are on. LNAV and VNAV is not armed currently, we'll arm those just before takeoff. The minimums ref, the minimums reference, so typically for the 737 you would set a value using this knob here for what we call the M-FRAE, the minimum flap retraction altitude. I don't think this is applicable to the Airbus or some of the other aircraft, but it just means it's a value. So if I roll this selection here, you'll see a value pop up here. It's used for an ILS decision height, but for departure it is set to the airfield elevation plus 1,000 feet, which today is 1,313, 1313, and that is the minimum altitude at which you'd climb the aircraft to before starting to clean up and accelerate in the event of an engine failure. So you climb to 1313, so 1,000 feet. In fact, I think they rounded up to the nearest whole number, so 1,320. Over 1,000 feet above airfield elevation before you start to clean up in the event of an engine failure. So that goes in there just as a reference. So the minimum reference is Barrow, and it's set 1320. The auto brake is RTO. The comm radios, we're currently talking to tower, and there's nobody online after that. And the doors, we can confirm, are closed and the lights are out. So we are ready for push and start. So we have been cleared to push and start at our discretion. So I'm using GSX, so I will in fact it's just worth noting before we do that, just grab the charts real quick over here. So I'm using Navigraph, and that has the real handy Simlink feature, so I'll just pop that on so we can see where we are in the world, assuming that doesn't support moving maps. Lovely. So I can tell you we're on gate Bravo 74 here. So we want to push with the nose facing to the left, because obviously we don't. Or do we? Going for 30. Yes, we do. So there we go. That just shows us where we are in the world. We want to push with the nose facing left so that we can then taxi out for 30. So it's just worth noting that, because you may well have the option of a left or right pushback, and we don't want to push the wrong way, because that just messes up the amount of time we can take into taxi and generally upsets control and so on. So with that in mind, get GSX up, and we're going to ask for push and departure, and we're going to go nose left, tail right. We do not want to start the engines before pushback, because we will do that during the pushback. And here he comes. So we'll just let GSX do its thing. And I'll just very quickly pop on to no questions or anything in the chat. That's cool. Once we actually more so when we get into the cruise, but by all means pop questions in there and I'll try and answer them if I get the opportunity. At some stage, Gatwick to Tenerife is a must. Yeah, I will definitely get that one done. That's a much longer flight, so you can imagine we're already 45 minutes into this one, and the flight time is an hour. So you can imagine the flight time for that is nearly 4 hours. So that'll be a long old video, but we can certainly do it. Or we might chop it up into sections, maybe take out the cruise bit. But yeah, we'll definitely do that one. I particularly like Tenerife because it's one of the places I used to go on holiday when I was a kid. So there we go. Okay. Ground are ready for us to go, so they've told us that we can release the parking brakes, and off we go. All engines clear, start at will. So we'll just let him get slightly off the blocks, and then we will. Oh, hello! Some emergency. I didn't take the air bridge out. That's always fun. Sorry about that, guys. We just ripped the front off the air bridge. So. If we go overhead, what we're looking for is, in fact, this is something I probably should have done just before we pushed, actually, is to pop the anti-collision light on, because that goes on before we push. And we turn the packs off to give us increase in pressure for the pressurised air engine start. So we've got the packs off, we've got the anti-collision light on, and we can go ahead and start the number 2. So we take the number 2 engine start switch to ground, come down to the lower display unit first of all, and we look at the N2 value, which is increasing. Obviously different aircraft will have very different startup procedures. I know for a fact the Airbus is a very much more automated system, but you still have to monitor, make sure everything is coming up. We're looking for 25% on the N2, which we have. Fuel the engine start levers go to idle, and we're watching the EGT and the fuel flow rise, and the N1 start to rise. Luckily Tower has stayed online for us. We've also got Cleveland Centre online, which we should be flying through en route, so hopefully put the parking brake on. They will take us en route. So the number 2 is started, the start valve is closed, and the switch has sprung back to the off position, so we can start the number 1 in the same manner, turning the N2 first, watching the N2 rise, looking for 25% N2. .25 coming on there, and the start switch to idle. EGT and fuel flow are rising, and the N1 is rising. We're looking for 56% on the N2 for the starter to cut out.
Dallas Tower, Navajo Echo Delta 3560 Bravo, 22 miles to the southeast, inbound to land. IFR.
Good for you. So we've got 2 good starts. What we can do...
Calling Dallas Tower, you're outside my airspace. Continue.
We can do the overhead flow. So we've got 2 good starts. We can pop the engine generators on the bus, and they are now supplying electrical power to the aircraft. We can ditch the APU bleed switch, and then from the top we just confirm we've got trim air, recirc fans auto, packs go to auto, isolation valve goes to auto, the bleed is off, and we can then turn off the APU. We are no longer requiring that. Probe heats go on, and then we can come down to the lower display unit, lower DU, and go to the controls page, and we can do the flight controls check. So we've got elevators are full forward, full aft, neutral, ailerons full left, full right, and neutral, rudder full left, full right, and neutral, and we can select flaps 5, which is what we need. We can then blank the lower display unit as well, because that will stay off now unless something pops out of parameters, and then you'll get a message come up down there. So if that's blank, all is good in the engine and oil pressure and temperature world. So we can now run the before taxi checklist. I'll just pop the engine. So the engine start switches go to continuous in all critical phases of a flight, so they can go to continuous. So we can run the before taxi checklist. We've got the generators are on bus, the probe heat's on, the wing anti-ice is not required, and the engine anti-ice is currently not required. The packs are auto, the isolation valve is auto, the APU bleed is off, the APU is off, the engine start switches are continuous. The flaps are 5 required, 5 selected, and green light. The elevator trim is set, flight controls are checked. The recall is checked, nothing there. If you hit recall and something stays up, it means there is something that needs some attention. The lower display unit is off, and we can call for taxi. So get your notes page up, ready to go, get your pen and paper, whatever you're using, and be ready to copy your taxi clearance. Tower Delta 1485, request taxi.
Delta 1485, runway 30, taxi via Zulu, Yankee 11.
Zulu, Yankee 11, 430 to Delta 1485.
Delta 1485, use information, hotel is current alternative 3007.
Copied Hotel 3007 for Delta 1485. So he's given us a taxi clearance and just reminded us what the QNH is, what the altimeter setting is, just because it's been a while since we spoke to him last, so he's just making sure we have everything current. So we're here on Charlie, facing west, and he's given us taxi clearance on the Zulu, down to Yankee 11 holding point, which is down here, or the Yankee 11 spur there. So we're going to just come out here, left onto Zulu, and all the way down to the holding point 430. So we can keep the moving maps up, or the Navigraph charts up on the other monitor, and verify then that we are following the right taxi routing. So we can just go overhead, pop the turn-offs and the taxi lights on, and go ahead and release the brakes and give it some throttle. Advance the thrust levers there and begin to move forward, and then just gentle tap on the brakes, confirm that the brakes are working, and then maintaining about
Tower Navo, Echo Delta 3560 Bravo, 10 miles out from the southwest.
Just going to turn him down a bit for you. Maintaining about 10, no more than about 10 knots on the apron. Not 2 knots, which is what we're currently doing.
3560 Bravo Tower. Your flight plan shows you landing at DCA. Is that are you landing at Dulles or DCA?
Dulles, sir, that must have been a glitch on my part. Sorry about that.
Okay, so we're coming off of the ramp, and Zulu is the first intersecting taxiway that we've got running right to left, and we are turning to the left to go down to runway 30. So you would just confirm out to the right, nothing there, clear to the right, clear to the left, and you can start the turn around.
3560 Bravo, clearance to Fox Bravo, spot 5640.
And then we're out onto a taxiway, so we can accelerate to, I think it's around about 30 knots, depending on the aircraft type. I think depending on the carrier, what their operational procedures dictate. But we can certainly go a bit faster than the 10 that we were doing on the apron. Okay, so during the taxi then, we are off the ramp now, so we can pop the transponder to TARA. Squawking my Charlie now for Delta 1485. That's one of the things I have forgotten about the States. they like to have the transponder on when you're on the ground. So VPilot has a setting where as soon as you take off, it will automatically pop this into mode Charlie and give you broadcast your height information, your speed information. They like to have it on the ground in the States, so just should have made sure we popped that on before we started taxiing. So that was my oversight. Don't fly a lot in the States, so that's one of the things I've overlooked there. So in the taxi then we would pop the transponder, as I said, to TARA, and that'll start transmitting our TCAS information and looking out for other traffic. We can pop the auto throttle to ARM, and we can then put the weather radar on the captain's side or the pilot flying side, and we'll have data as well. And on the first officer's side we'll have the terrain and the data. And then we would just review the departure. So nothing's changed. It is a runway 30 for departure with the Jerez 2 departure, climbing ahead to on 301, heading to 820 feet, starting a turn to 320, and then radar vectors to the Jerez transition. No speed or altitude restrictions on those legs. So that is the departure briefing reviewed, no change. And we're just then following the taxiway down to our holding point of Yankee 11430. So yeah, just quickly double check then while we're on the taxi if anyone's dropped me any questions. Nothing there. Okay, fine, no worries. As I say, don't be afraid, just pop questions in and I'll try and get to them as and when I'm able. Good. So just looking ahead, I'm using Vatsim, which is one of the many programs, many interfaces that allows you to look into Vatsim. We've got Cleveland and Toronto centres, so we should have some ATC available to us on the way down. So we're coming up to the little turn here. We need to come left onto Yankee 11, and that'll take us to the hold. So we've reviewed the takeoff, and we can just run then the before takeoff checklist to the lines. So the fuel flow is reset and on rate. The centre pumps are not required, the de-ice is not required, the cabin lights we can assume are being controlled by the cabin crew. The flight instruments are checked, the engine instruments are checked. The takeoff data is reviewed, no change, and the nav equipment is set, and we can tell the tower that we're approaching the hold, ready for departure. So we just tell them then we are approaching the hold and we are fully ready. Delta 1485 is approaching the hold, ready for departure.
Delta 1485 on departure, flight heading 320, wind 190 at 6, runway 30, clear for takeoff.
320 after departure, runway 30, clear for takeoff, Delta 1485. So we'll just come short of the hold there quickly. We don't cross this hold without clearance first of all, and also we don't cross the hold without the landing lights on, and the taxi lights can go, and the position lights can go to strobe as well. We would just clear on the approach, make sure nobody's coming in, and then we can enter the active. So he's given us after departure flight heading 320, which is as per the charts. So what would normally happen here is if approach were online, is you'd be told after departure contact whichever approach facility it is, Dulles Departures or whatever their call sign is for whatever airport you're departing from. 320 and clear for takeoff, and then you fly that heading and call them as soon as you're airborne. Obviously there's nobody available after tower here, so we'll just start vectoring ourselves. So we've been cleared for takeoff. We've verified that we are on 30, which is correct, and we can do a rolling takeoff. So we'll set 40% on the thrust, let the engine stabilise. There we go, that's thrust stable. Hit the toga switch, take off, go around, which is actually on the throttles down here, but I've got a button mapped to the throttle, and we can confirm that the thrust is selected and set. We've got the airspeed is alive, and I'm just following the centre line using the rudder pedals. Standard procedure will be to have your hand on thrust levers and one hand on the yoke until V1. So we're just confirming that everything is within parameters, aircraft is accelerating, and we're coming up on V1, which is there. Rotate, so pulling back gently about 3.5 degrees per second and up to 15 degrees, and the gear can come up. I'm just holding that until 820 feet, which is there, starting the right turn to 320. And just following the flight director cues for the minute until we get onto that heading, and then we can pop it into VNAV and LNAV. We're still hand flying the aircraft because the autopilot's not in command, but we're just using LNAV and VNAV to give us steering cues. So we're coming up on 3,000 feet, which is our stop climb altitude. And over to Unicom 122.8, thanks very much for your service, have a good evening, Delta 1485. Okay, so we've hit our stop climb of 3,000, so we'll just hold that there for a second, and we'll let the aircraft accelerate and retract the flaps on schedule as we do so, and we would assume, just turn him down a bit, we'd assume then that we've been cleared by approach at that point to climb further. They might say climb via the SID flight level 120, for example. So we can just dial in 120. Sorry, that'd be 12,000 feet actually, because it's below the transition altitude here. It's quite high in the States. So climb via the SID to 12,000, which we can pop in 12,000, let the aircraft climb away, and just confirm that we have retracted the flaps. And then the aircraft's climbing away, we can run the after takeoff checklist. It all does come very quickly, and obviously we've not got approach or anyone talking to us, so single pilot ops at this point can get pretty hectic, especially if you're then calling up approach or someone like that and getting vectors from them. So we'll assume that if we look at the flight plan, if I zoom out, we're currently there's a break in the flight plan. We're on this line here because the flight plan, there's the SID, the SID that we're flying, has a special line in there for vectors, because you would expect to be vectored. Not all of them do, this one does. So we might say approach have cleared us to turn right to a heading of 360. So we can simply dial in 360 or 000 and pop it into heading select, and the aircraft will start to turn. So that will start to turn us towards our track. At the moment it's still the active leg, if we go to the FMC, is still vectors, because that is an actual part of the procedure, is it expects you to be steered by approach. So let's say they've given us a heading of 360, which we're flying, and then said go direct to Jerez. So there's two ways of doing this depending on the aircraft you're flying. We're obviously doing the Boeing method, which is to grab the leg that you want to go direct to, bring it up to the top and execute, and that is now the active waypoint that we're heading towards. And if we pop it into LNAV, that tells the autopilot, the MCP, to listen to what the FMC is telling it and steer accordingly. So we can now run the after takeoff checklist. So as I say, this all comes pretty thick and fast in the departure stage. So we've got the auto brakes are off, the gear lever is off, the landing lights and taxi turn off lights are off, and the pressurization is the air conditioning and pressurization is checked and normal. So next, passing 10,000 feet, which we've already done, we would lose the landing lights and the assuming that it's not too turbulent, which it's not too bad. We'll leave them on for a little bit, while longer. The seatbelt signs will be checked at 10,000 whether we want to turn them off or not. So we're approaching already 12,000 feet, so we can assume that approach have now cleared us up to, let's say, flight level 220. So we can just make sure the aircraft is following that climb, and we're going up to 220. So now we've been cleared from an altitude up to a flight level. What does that mean? Well, the transition altitude is the point at which we go from whatever local QNH, local altimeter setting we were on, over to the standard setting. Standard is 29.92 or 1013, depending on where you are in the world. Both mean the same thing. They both mean that your altimeter is set to the same as everybody else once they're up in the flight levels, and that way if you're flying at flight level 270, which is what we're flying, going to be cleared up to today, and there's someone coming the other way at flight level 260, you will definitely be 1,000 foot apart, because if he was on one setting from where he took off and we were on a different setting from where we took off, we could be a lot less than 1,000 feet apart. So by having a standard setting, everyone is on the same thing, and we are separated by a clear 1,000 foot. So we've been cleared, fictitiously of course, to flight level 220. So we simply punch standard in here, and we see that goes over to standard down here on the PFD, and we're now on standard, climbing to a flight level. And that is the critical phase of flight. That's probably the most stressful phase of flight, is that bit from lining up to being cleared up to the flight levels, because it comes really thick and fast. It is kind of you just kind of get used to it. You've got to, if you learn the aircraft and practice the aircraft and practice flying the departures, when you get into Vatsim, it will become easier. It's never as straightforward as that. It's always a bit of a mess for your head if lots of things are happening at once. You're trying to keep on top of it all, but that's why if you learn the aircraft and if you sort of plan ahead and think about what you're doing, you stand the best chance of getting away and getting up into the cruise nice and easy without having too many dramas. So that's why I always say to people who want to get onto Vatsim, learn the aircraft first, learn to fly the aircraft, learn the procedures. You can do it in the sim to your heart's content with no one online, just flying on your own, learning how to do it, and then when you get into Vatsim, brilliant, you'll have that nailed and you can just crack on with learning to talk on the radio. So our routing today will take us, if we have a look at the route map here, we're basically going to go due north for a time up to Stony Fork here in is that northern Pennsylvania, and then go west over Buffalo, straight over Niagara Falls, and down into Toronto. So we should have, by my calculation, looking at Vatastic, if we go and have a little look down here, where are we? Delta 1485. Our routing should take us into Cleveland's airspace. Now let's have a look. We can do a couple of things we can do here. We can click on there and have a look, see if anything comes up. Nothing. Yeah, we go. Cleveland Center. So he's providing services for all these airfields, top-down services, and surrounding airfields, and the Cleveland area. So in theory, once we get close to the boundary of his airspace, we should get a little call from him saying, hello, can you please contact me on that frequency 134.9. So what I would do, is we'll just come down to the radio panel, put in 134.9 on standby, and then we'll await and see if he calls us up. So we're coming up to 220. We can imagine we've been cleared all the way up to 270, which is our final flight level. And we'll just set that. Every 10,000 feet or so you will just go overhead and verify that the pressurization is normal, the cabin is still in the climb, and the differential is within limits. It's smoothed out now, so we can release the passengers, and generally speaking we've got quite a nice evening ahead of us. We'll just increase the range on the first officer's side there. What we would do as well is just to keep the heading bug updated. A little bit of clouds just decided to pop up there. We keep the heading bug updated to our current heading, so if we were suddenly told by air traffic to turn left 10 degrees for traffic or something like that, we're already there. We can just pop in a heading select and it's already pointing the right way. So we just keep that updated as we go through the various turns at each waypoint. And then we're just waiting for flight level 270 to come up. So already, if we go down to the FMC, have a look at the progress page, we would also be looking here just to confirm that fuel predictions are within limits. So we've currently got 4.5 tonnes of fuel, we're estimating 3 tonnes on board at Toronto. We've got 50, so it is now 1-1, and we're expecting an arrival at 5-8. So we've not got all that long before we want to start thinking about the descent. So already we can start thinking about descent planning. So you'd normally be 100 miles from top of descent before we do that, but I'm just going to start it now, although we're not actually in the cruise yet. But I need to talk through it, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and suddenly find that we've missed our top of descent point. And also we can anticipate control talking to us in a little while. So what we'll do, we'll go across to active sky and check out the latest weather for Toronto. Winds 140 at 4 knots, temperatures 25, QNH 1. The altimeter will be 3000. QNH 1016. And then this is all the forecast down here, but we're just concerning ourselves with what it is currently at the moment. So we're still expecting an arrival on a 1.5, and what I would do, I'll just show you a little trick that I use here. If we go to flight radar 24, and we just bring that up on the live radar, and if we just go, so this is real world now, this is nothing to do with the sim, this is actually tracking real world flights. If we go to Toronto and zoom in on Toronto, which is there, Toronto International, there we go, and we can just have a look at what they're on. So they're currently actually they're operating, even though the winds are 1.4. Let's have a look at the charts. I'm just bringing it up on the iPad, so I don't need to drag it across. I just want to have a look at the current runway configuration here at Toronto. We're on the 2.4s, so this is an current incoming flight, actually live inbound now to Toronto, and we can guess from this that he is landing on 2.4 right. So we can plan then, in actual fact, on the basis of that information, we can plan on a 2.4 right arrival. So we'll get rid of, in fact we'll keep the flight plan up because we'll need that fairly shortly, and just pop that over here. So we're going to go back to, we'll see, got a bit of weather coming in as well. Go back to the FMC, so just so it has the most current up-to-date plan, we'll pop the new plan in, which is going to be arrival, still with the same terminal arrival route, the same star, but it's going to be a 24 right ILS, and the Ling 8 for 24 goes into there. Still a WASI transition, and then if we look at the charts, and we can just talk through what all that actually means in the real world. So we'll find the charts for Toronto. So this is what you'd have to go through every time. I'm just going to download those, and they're just going to load up in front of us. Good to see the old fibre broadband is working really well here tonight. Okay, so we're anticipating an arrival of the Ling 8 for runway 24. So if we just use a little target there to lock that in down the right hand side, which means we've got that as a little shortcut there, then we can have a look at the chart. And we're coming in from WASI down to Easton and then Ling. We've got a restriction of 250 knots at Ling, then youth between 11,000 and 13,000 feet, down to Bimpo, Verco at 220 knots, and then a right turn to Marod between 3,100 and 4,500 at 210 knots. Deckney at 3,000, that's a hard altitude, there's a line above and below, so that's at 3,210 knots. Davno. And then the approach will be the ILS approach for runway 24 right. So if we use a little target there as well, just to lock that in as a shortcut on the right hand side. And then you can see, so we'll be flying down to the last fix on the arrival, which is Davno, and then transitioning onto the ILS from Pikma. So if we go to the FMC, and we are going to transition from Pikma, so we can pop that in as our transition. Lovely, the Sims decided to have a little meltdown. Just give it a moment, see what it's up to. Are we back in the game now? There we go. It might be the weather outside that's causing it to have a little meltdown. So transitioning via Pikma, so we've got that selected all correctly, and we can execute that and just clear that out. And then we would just go to the legs page and confirm that we don't have any gaps, which we do. So we can just fill up, a lovely bit of lightning there, fill up the discontinuity by grabbing the next waypoint that we want, which is WASI, popping it in the box and executing that. That gets rid of that discontinuity, and then we just look further down to see there's no discontinuities there. Again, this is a procedure that has a planned leg, a planned section for vectors. So coming off of that Davno, which is the last fix of the arrival route, it would expect us to be vectored by approach if we haven't already been done so before we go direct to Pikma. So there's no direct course linking those two. So it will lock us onto that 057 heading or track once we pass that fix until we tell it to do something else. So that's something you've always got to keep on top of. If you suddenly find you're just shooting off randomly, that's probably why. It's got a bit of lightning going on, which is always fun, but we're clear of it, so that's fine. So to plan the descent, the pilot flying would hand over to the pilot monitoring, and he would then plan the descent how he wants it, plan the approach. So we've ascertained that we're going to be on 24 right almost certainly, although that may change, so we'll see what we get. We've got the charts ready, and if we look at the charts, we're going to look at the ILS for 24 right, and this is what we're interested in here. We've got a few bits we need to take from this. Transition altitude is the same on the way down as it is on the way up. The frequency for the ILS and the inbound course, which you're going to need to tune, and this figure down here, the decision height for a Category C aircraft, which we are, which is 796 feet. So I'll show you how all that goes into the aircraft. So first thing we're going to do is tune the ILS on 109.3 237 inbound. So we can set 237 inbound on the course. Some more automated aircraft, like some of the newer Boeings and some of the a lot of the Airbuses, you simply tell it in the FMC or the MCDU what approach you're flying, and it will tune the radios for you. But in Boeing, we do it in the old school fashion, 237, and we pop it in on both sides in the 737, so that will give us a full ILS capability and a full auto land if it's available. Then we go down to the nav1 radio. On the standby side, we dial in 109.3, which is the frequency for the ILS, and hit the transfer and go to active. Normally leave it on the standby side if we were tuning en route VORs, but we're not. We're just going to pop it straight in on the active side. On both sides again, so on the captain side and the first officer side. So you've got two systems running the ILS, and then they can be coupled to give it a much more accurate path down the ILS as we get further into the arrival. So the ILS is tuned. There's a couple of things that we need to do in the FMC. First off, we'll go to the legs page and look for the fix for our actual runway, which is runway 24 right. If we line select that, go to the fix page and reselect there, it will pop it in as a fix. And what that means is we can do a couple of things in here which give us some neat little tricks for planning our arrival. So if we pop in /10 in the first line, /5 in the second line, it'll put range rings at 10 miles and 5 miles around that fix. And that is our runway, that's the runway we're landing on. And what that will do is give us physical lines in the nav display, in the navigation display, to tell us when we're 10 miles and 5 miles from touchdown, and we can use those to configure the aircraft. So we configure flaps 5 and get the speed under control at 10 miles, and then coming up to 5 miles we get gear down flap 15, and then passing 10 miles we continue to slow the aircraft down to the final approach speed. So those range rings will come up as actual rings on the ND, and they're just there as a physical reminder. You can see them, and that tells you when you need to start configuring the aircraft. So the fixed range rings are in, and then we need to plan our landing performance. So I'm using something called QSIM Planner, which is a little bit of software which is fairly accurate. It does the job alright. There's a whole host of different profiles in there for different aircraft, and you can use it to calculate the whole thing, fuel and stuff like that. I'm just using it for the landing performance, and it's very similar to using the other one that I showed you for the departure planning. So we do the same sort of thing. So we're landing at Charlie Yankee Yankee Zulu on runway, expecting 24 right, and we just confirm by looking at the charts that the available length of the runway is correct. And looking at the charts or active sky will tell you the elevation of the airfield, which I can tell you is 569 feet, so that is slightly wrong. The inbound heading is 237. Well, if we look at our course for the ILS, 237 is correct. We're flying 737-800. Ignore the registration, that's irrelevant. The METAR, if we import the METAR and then just double check with Active Sky, 120 at 6 knots, temperature 25, 2999 is the altimeter, and the runway is currently dry. So if we go to the FMC, just to get the last bit of data there, go to the init ref page, and that will now become the approach reference page. So what we need to do here is get the gross weight on landing. That's our current gross weight, 64.7 tons, but obviously we're going to burn a bit of fuel before we get there. So if we go to the progress page, the difference between the fuel we've got now, which is 3.8 tons, and the fuel on landing, which is 2.9 tons, is 0.9 of a ton, 900 kilos. So if we go to the init ref page and take 900 off of there, it will be 63.7 tons. So if we pop in the figure that it will be when we land, 63.7, and just watch what it does to these figures here. It probably won't change a lot, but it just means, there we go, it's just reduced by a couple of knots. So that gives you the most accurate landing weight and flap reference speeds for the approach. So we can take that figure and go back into the planner. 63.7 tons, 63,700 kilos goes into the landing weight, and calculate. That will give us our figures down here. And that little beep there was just to tell us for the V-pilot that somebody is talking to us. As expected, Cleveland Centre, please contact me 134.9, which we should have pre-selected down here, 134.9, and we do. So we report in with our current flight level. Cleveland Centre, good evening, Delta 1485, with your flight level 270.
Good. 27 left off of Victor from Sierra to Victor is first, and then Victor to 21 right. So cross over 21 left and then hold short 21 right.
May have just stomped on somebody's transmission there. Always polite to have a listen first before you transmit, just to avoid stamping on anybody. I think I may have done there. I think they were in the middle of something. Give them a chance to come back to us. So let's go back to the planning. So we're looking at...
I got 3159, I sent it via text. The way the phraseology changed, there was a recent change to the 7110 that...
Turn him down for you there. So it's telling us that if we use auto brakes, turbo flaps 30, we will stop in that distance, leaving us 509 metres remaining. So if we increase the auto brake settings, similarly we'll get 1,051 metres remaining and 1,900 and... ident Delta 1485. So he's asked us to squawk ident, so we just hit the ident button on the V-pilot control panel there, and that will flash up on his scope. He should be able to identify us more easily. And he should come back with radar contact if he's spotted us. And ident again, 1485.
Contact 20 miles northwest, 270. The 7 miles discretion across Piston at maintain 1717,000. Toronto altimeter 2999.
So just say again the altitude restriction for Easton for 1485.
1485, 7 miles discretion across Piston at maintain 1717,000.
Maintain 170 for Easton and 2999 the altimeter for Toronto Delta 1485. Okay, so he's given us an altitude restriction of flight level 170 at 17,000 feet rather at Easton. So if we pop in 17,000, in fact, get that right, pop a forward slash in, and then 17,000, and line select it to there, and that gives us a restriction there. We just go to the progress page, look at the top of descent. There, we've got 46 miles to go to top of descent in order to make that restriction. So he's given us a hard restriction of 170 at Easton, which we popped in there, and we can verify that that is there. He's also confirmed the altimeter for Toronto is 2999, so we can show you a cool little trick here. If you look there where it says standard, there's nothing currently underneath it. If I'll just come back up to the MCP, grab the altimeter setting knob there, and twist it, and you'll get a figure in. And then you can pre-select your altimeter setting. That should be a bit hard to see on that zoom level, but it should be 2999. And then if you hit the standard again, it will just swap it back over. Okay, so one last thing to do, if we look at Vatsim, so it says Delta 1485 here, our next control should be Toronto Centre. So if we just pop on there and have a look, I'm guessing this is the one, yeah. So this one is controlling the southern Toronto region. Just double check that. Or they're both saying the same thing, are they? No, they're not. There we go. So I'm assuming that Toronto will be on 125.77, so we can pre-tune that as well. So that hopefully when he gives us a handover, we'll have it pre-selected. In fact, looking at them, they're both on the same frequency. 125.77. There we go. So we've got that pre-selected, and then we're just looking at the top of descent point coming up here. One thing I have just overlooked, or not quite got around to doing, it's subjective whether you want to do it or not. If you want to be entirely accurate, what you would do in this aircraft, not in the Airbus, but in this aircraft particularly, if we go to the descent page and go to forecast, you can populate all of this with the winds information in the cruise. Some of the more advanced aircraft, like the 777, you can actually upload a wind data file, and it'll do all this for you. But you can go ahead and just take the wind information from the flight plan and pop those in, this information here from these lines in the flight plan. So they typically put in flight level 200, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet, and the information, the wind information for those into the descent forecast, and then that just helps VNAV to plan that descent a little bit more accurately. Also, what you would do in here as well is put the transition level in so that the FMC knows when you are down below a flight level back into an altitude. So control's a little bit more active on this centre than the previous one, so we've got a lot of transmissions going off. Hopefully they're not too loud for you guys. I've got him quite loud in my ears, but I've managed to turn him down for you guys, so it's not deafening you. Hi Tim. Yes, so we're in the PMDG 737. For those of you guys that are on X-Plane, the Zebo mod for the default 737 is pretty damn good as far as I'm aware. It does most things that the PMDG does. And yeah, we're using Navigraph for the charts. So Navigraph comes in a couple of formats. This is the desktop version, and there's also an iPad app which I run on the iPad next to me while I'm in flight as well.
Heading on Victor should be about a 280 heading, so you should be heading westbound on Victor. Runway 21 right on visor next turn.
So, FMC is telling us we need to reset MCP altitude. Basically that's saying if you want me to follow the VNAV descent profile, then I need to be allowed to descend very shortly, because top of descent is coming up. So he's cleared us down to 170, which is... he's cleared us to descend, and he's told us to be level at 170 at Easton. So if we pop in 170, that will guarantee that we don't go below 170 before that waypoint. And there is top of descent. So we've captured the VNAV profile. The aircraft will start to close the throttles. You can see the FMA, the flight mode annunciator, at the top here. It says retard, so it's retarding the throttles. And it will go to an idle descent. And there we go, so we've got ARM LNAV VNAV path. I'm just going to turn him down a bit because he's really deafening me. There we go. So we've got ARM LNAV VNAV path on the FMAs, and that's just telling us that the auto throttle has gone into the ARM mode, which means it's ready to take over if we get wildly out of shape in terms of speed. But presently it is in idle, and we can grab the thrust levers and manipulate them if we need to. It's in VNAV path, which means it's concentrating mostly on that VNAV path, maintaining that profile at the cost of some speed. It will take over eventually, because obviously it won't allow the aircraft to get drastically out of whack in terms of speed, but it's concentrating mostly on maintaining that vertical profile. And LNAV, lateral navigation, is still being controlled by or via the FMC and the route that we put in there. And we're coming down the descent quite nicely. The speed is stable, so we don't need to do anything other than just monitor and make sure everything is cool. So we can, just one last thing to pop into the pressurization. If we just grab Active Sky quickly, it's on the charts as well, but the quickest way to find it is Active Sky. Make sure we've got the right airport selected, and look at the elevation, 570 feet all bar. Toronto 12577, thanks very much, have a good evening. Delta 1485. Okay, so we are over to Toronto Centre, which we had pre-tuned, so that's why we can just go and bosh the transfer key and go straight over to them. We're out of 22 for 17,000, level by Easton, so we will call them up. Toronto Centre, good evening, Delta 1485 with you, passing flight level 220 for 17,000, level by Easton.
Runway 24 right for arrival. Altimeter 2999er, descend to 12,000.
Descend 12,000 to 999er, expecting a 25 right, and we have Juliet on board for Delta 1485. So he's given us the runway to expect, which is 24 right, which is thankfully what we had expected and planned for, so that all works out nicely. He's told us to descend down to 12,000, just confirmed that the altimeter is still 2999er. So we've made sure we've got that set, so we'll be at the height he's expecting us to be at. and he's just told us that the information Juliet is current. I told him we had it, which is a bit of a lie, but we have active sky, and we know that that is exactly what he's seeing out in the airfield as well. So rather than calling up or tuning in the ATIS and listening to it, I'm just looking at active sky and say, yeah, I know what the weather is. You can, as I said before, just look at the ATIS for, make sure you get the right airport if there's more than one online. Double click that and it will call it up in text for you. So we've got information Juliet, which is what he told us. Winds are 130 at 6, which is what I'm seeing in active sky. Visibility is 10k, which is fine. Clouds are what we'd expect. Temperatures 2.5, which is correct what active sky is telling us. And runway 24 right is what we are expecting for arrival. Cool. So that is what he told us, which is what was in active sky. So everything adds up, so we won't get any nasty surprises. And I've totally lost my train of thought about what I was talking about before he interrupted me with a handover. I hope you caught all the transmissions as well. I had turned the volume down a bit for you guys, just because some of the transmissions were getting pretty loud. So I hope you caught what he was saying to me. So we passed the transition altitude of flight level 180, and I left it deliberately. Although we've been cleared to an altitude, you'll see now that down here the standard box that was green has now gone to yellow, because we put in the descent forecast page the correct transition level. Down here we put in flight level 180 in the descent forecast page. It then knew that passing flight level 180 we need to go to standard, and we haven't done, so it just goes yellow to remind us that we're on the wrong setting. So that's always a neat little trick just to remember, and to remind yourself if you've not set it. There we go. So we can finish off as what we were doing, the landing performance. So we're going to aim for auto brake 3, and I will show you how we come to that conclusion. If we go to the charts and look at the charts for the airport, we're landing on 24 right. We're coming in from the northeast, landing in a southwesterly direction, and that means the further we roll out, the longer we've got to taxi back. So we're going to aim for something like one of the rapid exits down here to vacate onto Charlie. So if we anticipate auto brake 3, and that gave us a rollout of 1905 meters, 1905 meters. That should get us off around about midway down the arrival runway, and mean that we're not taxiing in too long. So we can go auto brake 3, so we'll select auto brake 3 up here, which we've done, and if we just go down to the FMC, we just need to finish off the last bit of descend 8,000 does 1485, so it cleared now down to 8,000, still on the same altimeter. If it hasn't changed, otherwise he would have told us. So it's also saying drag required. You can see we've got speed restrictions, and the commanded speed has now come back to 250, but we're not slowing down because it's still in VNAV. It's trying to maintain that profile, so it's telling us I need a bit of help here. So what we're going to do, rather than pitching up to slow down and then getting off of the VNAV profile, we'll just extend some speed brakes, and that should help to slow the aircraft. Descent planning. So that's where we are. We would definitely finish this descent planning before we get down into the approach. So we go to the init ref page. We can just confirm that we've got the ILS tuned, or the right ILS selected, 109.3237, which we know we've tuned and set. We've got a 2,956 meter runway available on Toronto 24 right. Because we're aiming to exit around about midway on a rapid exit, we can accept flaps 30 and 147 knots, and that just means that our VREF speed is going to be flaps 30 will be our final flap setting, 147 knots will be our VREF speed. Of course that means it's never as simple as that. VREF is your reference speed, and then we need to take into account the wind. So there's a wind correction to be added or subtracted from your VREF. So just looking at the wind at the moment, it is 120 at 6 knots, which means we've got basically a crosswind. So there's actually no headwind factor, so there's no addition to be made from the wind. However, it's always a 5 knot addition or half the headwind component, whichever is greater. So as there's no headwind component, we're adding the minimum addition of 5 knots. If there was a 20 knot direct headwind, we'd add half of that, which is 10 knots. So for now, our correction will be plus 5 knots. That's the minimum correction we do. So it's actually going to be 152 knots will be the speed we're flying at. I know it gets very complicated. Check out Flight Deck 2 Sim for some more advanced 737 stuff. I think this is all fairly relevant to the Airbus and stuff like that as well. But certainly check out Flight Deck 2 Sim if you're flying the Boeings. Okay, so we're coming up on 10,000 feet, which is our next point of interest, which is going to be, you heard the ding there, that was the seatbelt signs, because they're on auto, they've gone on passing 10 anyway. And also we then put the fixed landing lights and the turn-off lights on as well, the forward-facing external lights below 10,000 feet. And we just come down and confirm that we are indeed below 250, below 10,000 feet, which is a pretty much international speed restriction. I don't think there's many places that don't operate that speed restriction. We're now reducing further to 220, because if you remember in the legs page there is a restriction in the SID that we've put in, sorry, in the STAR, in the terminal arrival, there's a restriction of 220 knots by Verco, so it is planned and allowed for that, and we have hit 220, so we can get rid of the speed brakes as well. Actually visual with the airport ahead of us now. Sim's having a bit of a moment there as well, it's just freezing up my mouse, that's always good. And that little horn there means we've got 1 to go to our cleared altitude, so we're currently cleared to 8,000 and we're passing 9 for 8. And he will hopefully give us further descent fairly shortly. He's going to, if you remember, if I just zoom out very slightly, in fact, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll just go to the legs page in the FMC. Descend 6,000 down to 1485. So we're now down to 6,000. There's a couple of ways we can do this, because the aircraft probably, has it leveled off? No, it's not quite captured. No, it hasn't. Descend 6,000 down to 1485. Go ahead for Delta 1485. Stand by 1. So I've replied to him and he's not heard me, so just give us a moment and we'll see if we can resolve the problem. It could be a dodgy internet connection at one of either ends.
5, Roger, if you could do your read back some text for now, please. If you can hear me indicate you can hear this transmission.
So I'm just communicating on text by him. I'll just drag that over so you can see.
1485 descending 3,000.
There we go. So I'm just typing to him at the moment, and what I'm going to do is just disconnect and reconnect very quickly and see if that fixes the problem, because quite often with vPilot that does. So I'll just let him know what I'm doing. So he's not replied, so we're just going to close vPilot out altogether and then restart it. I have to run it as admin, otherwise it doesn't load up. It's a latest update thing. We'll just go back and reconnect. It's Delta 1485, make sure that's all correct. And then so we've got the little tone there to tell us we're back on Toronto Delta 1485 radio check.
Toronto Delta 1485 radio check.
1485, transmitting 8555.
And roger, we're level 6000 Delta 1485.
Level 6000 Delta 1485.
And good, we've got that little echo back, which sometimes happens.
1485, descend 4000.
274,000 Delta 1485.
274,000 Delta 1485.
So that'll be something to do with either my connection or their codec or something dodgy happening. So we can clear down to 4,000, so we can go into level change for that, and that will just hold the current speed and descend us down to our cleared altitude, close the throttles and do it in an idle descent. We'll just increase that rate of descent, we'll just pop the speed brakes out as well just to get us down a bit faster. And what we can also do, because we were getting high on profile, and we were in VNAV, the vertical profile is being controlled by the FMC, it sees that we're getting high on profile and will slow the aircraft down as much as it can do. So in order to allow VNAV to recapture the profile, you can actually increase the speed, and what it'll do is, rather than spool up the throttles, spool up the engines, it will just dive the aircraft a bit faster in order to catch that profile back up. What you would typically do probably in this instance is just put it into VS, vertical speed mode, and aim for about 2,000 feet per minute, and we'll have 240 knots so we don't go shooting through there.
1485, turn left heading 300.
Left 300, that's 1485.
Left 300, that's 1485.
Okay, so he's now giving us vectors, so we're on that leg of vectors, so we just pop in 300 and heading select, and that pops us into the selected heading mode. So what I actually did there, I don't know why it did that, so I just used the speed window to increase the target speed, but was in flight level change, so I think it should have just increased the rate of descent to catch that speed back up, but it didn't. It actually advanced the throttles, which typically I don't think it would normally do. Maybe that's just a PMDG thing, but either way, we're now back roughly where we want to be. We're being vectored, so we're ignoring that profile more now, because the controller is now sort of in charge of where he wants to put us, and he's vectoring us on to finals. We're now within 90 degrees of the runway heading, so you can see we've got a glide slope. Deflection and scale have materialised on the PFD. Within 90 degrees of the intercept heading, that will pop up on there, and we can expect
1485, turn left heading 270, and assist the localizer, cleared ILS 24, right lead 4000 on the glide.
left 270, cleared to the ILS 24 right, and descend on the glide for Delta 1485. So he's cleared us left 270 and intercept the ILS. So what I've done there, you can see that localizer deflection has already started to come across, so he's vectored us in pretty tight there. So what I did, I was a bit quick and I didn't explain what I was doing, but as I see that start to come across, just hit the VOR lock, the VOR lock button up on the MCP, and that ensures that it will capture the inbound course to that ILS. So you can arm approach mode once the glide slope is active, which it currently isn't because we're below the glide slope. Suffering from some terrible frame rates tonight as well. It's absolutely dreadful. So you can see it's captured the localizer and has steered us onto the localizer, and now the glide slope diamond has filled in and is starting to move down slowly. So a dot above, we can then go ahead and arm the approach mode.
Toronto Center, good evening, American 1250, with information Julius requesting Alpha to Boston.
So as a dot above, we can arm the approach mode.
American 1215, Toronto Center, getting cleared to Boston, low ignition actional, via the Captain 2 departure, bumper transition, flight plan routes, departure runway 24 right, 40524.
We're just going to start slowing the aircraft as well, because we're approaching that 10-mile range ring. So that green band there. I'll just zoom out. There we go.
Two departure, runway 24 right, empty, downhill transition, and we missed the squawk, American 1215.
American 1215, squawk 0524.
So those range rings there you can see.
0524 for American 1215.
We're just passing the 10-mile ring, so we're slightly fast. Nothing to be concerned about. We do need to think about getting the aircraft slowed down safely. So if we look down here, flap limits 250 knots for flaps 5, and we can go flaps 5 and speed brakes out at the same time. So we've got the speed brakes out to slow us down, and we'll go flaps 5 as well. And then the next thing we're looking for is this 5-mile range ring, where we'll go gear down flaps 15. So it's capture the ILS, we're fully established, we've got single channel, and now we can arm, so we've got the command A and B, which is 2 independent autopilot systems. Now we've got the ILS captured and we're above 1,000 feet, we can arm both, and they're now both coupled to the ILS, and you can get an auto land if you want one, but we won't, we'll take it out and land manually, but it's the most accurate ILS. And Delta 1485 is established, the ILS 24 right. So
1485 wings 1306, clear to land 24 right.
24 right, clear to land Delta 1485. So he's asked us to tell him when we're established, which we are, we've told him, and now we're coming up on 210 knots, which is the flap up speed. I want to slow the aircraft further right down to the flap 5 speed. I should probably have done that slightly before now. We're going to come in a little bit fast, but it's fine. So we're geared down at 5 miles, and we can go flaps 15. And it's going to be right on the limits of the flap 15 speed. So we've gone flaps 10. And that is still bugged, and then we can go flap 15, slow to the flap 15 speed, and then as the speed comes down we can continue down to flaps 30, and really we want to be fully established. So you can see on the right hand side there on the altitude tape there's a grey band coming in, and there's a yellow band coming in. We should be fully configured and stable by that time that yellow band comes. We get to that yellow band, which we're just about going to be. I'm a little bit out, so you might well call that a go around, but hey, we're in the sim and we're pretty much established. Speed is almost stable. Frame rates are absolutely killing me at the moment. I think the CPU is probably getting a bit warm. Okay, so we'll stop chatting and see if we can land the aircraft. So the auto throttle's coming out, the autopilot's coming out. Yes, thank you. Wow, we're getting a slideshow here. That is absolutely dreadful. I'm going to work on the assumption that the bit of a floater. A lot of a floater. And there we go, that is a dreadful touchdown. We've got reverse green and spoilers. We're going to miss that rapid exit, but that's fine. As there is another one coming up just here. We've got 60 knots, we go manual braking, cancel the reverses. Typically you would...
That was 1485, up the terrain, vacate right, whenever we report clear, and advise your crossing if you have one.
And roger, and we're clearing now to the right for 1485. So, let's try not to disappear off the side of the taxiway.
1485, Roger, taxi departing via Delta, Alpha, Juliet, correct, 33 right.
Taxiing Delta, Alpha and Juliet, crossing runway 30 Delta 1485. Okay, so I'm just going to bring it to a stop there quickly. As if there's 2 crew normally, so one would be obviously handling the aircraft, and in this case it's the captain's side. So all that would happen is he would retract the speed brakes and turn off the weather radar, and that would then tell the first officer that he's okay to go and do his cleanup. So he would retract the flaps, which I've already compulsively started to do as I was taxiing clear there. Turn the auto brakes to off. go overhead and turn the probes to off, and he would turn the transponder to the alt off position. And then we'll just bring up very quickly the chart so we can see what he's cleared us to. So he's cleared us to parking via Delta, Alpha and Juliet. So that would be, yeah, Delta, Alpha, Alpha, Juliet. So right on Delta, crossing 30, left on Alpha, and then Alpha Juliet into Terminal 3, which is where Delta will be parking. So again, we can leave those moving the Simlink map up on the right hand side just to confirm that we've definitely tracking on the right taxiways. And the last thing that the first officer will then do is set the lights. So I should have, what I should have done is popped all the landing lights on when we cleared it to land. But we're now obviously on the ground, so they can go off, and the strobe can go to steady. So we're just onto the taxi lights now, and then we're coming up to Delta on the right hand side, which is just here. So it does get a bit of a high workload for single pilot. You'd have to have your wits about you a bit. I did let things get, so it shows you how easy it is for things to get away with you. I got a little bit, okay, so it's the dynamic lighting maybe that's screwing up my frame rates, possibly. Interesting. I flew into Toronto the other night and had absolutely superb, lovely, smooth, in fact I think Jeremy, I think if you're still watching, I was chatting to him on Discord, and I think you'll probably be able to confirm that the frame rates were much better than this the last time we flew in here, so I don't know what's going on. Windows has done some updates since then, and they are typically notorious for throwing up all manner of issues. So we're on Delta, we're cleared across 3-3 and then left onto Alpha and into the terminal. So the last couple of things that the first officer would do is just reset the MCP. So the speed would go back to 100. He'd set an uneven or a non-round altitude figure in the altitude window, just to confirm for the next for them or for the next outgoing crew that they haven't received their clearance yet. That will only get set to a round number once they've received their clearance. And then the last thing to do before we get on to stand is just to get the APU running, and you typically try and time that so that you get power available as you're coming on to stand, but it's not running for too long before you get on stand, wasting too much fuel and upsetting the accountants. So we're crossing 3-3, just confirming there's nothing on the approach, nothing on the runway, and then crossing 3-3, and it will be second left on to Alpha. It's quite a long old taxi in here. The disadvantage of a stream rather than a video, of course, is that I can't edit out the taxi, so you just have to bear with this while we have a little tour around Toronto. This frame rate's bit hit and miss. So we've got Bravo on the left, and the next left should be Alpha. Which it is, so that's good. We've managed not to get lost, which is fine. Try and corner around about 10 knots in the 737, just save spilling the champagne. Getting that dynamic lighting where the nose wheel's actually lighting up the ground, which is nice. So yeah, it does depend obviously on how busy it is and how many controllers you've got online. We're still on tower, and he's given us our taxi clearance all the way to the gate. I would recommend, if you're starting out, to start out in a route or an airport where there's not too many controllers online, just because it means you can just stick to one guy from pushback and clearance and pushback right up to takeoff or to the climb out. So there's less to think about with changing frequencies at critical phases, because you will get frequency changes at real critical times, like just after you've taken off, when you're thinking about climbing out, getting the aircraft established, cleaned up, and then someone pops on and says, right, change to contact approach, and then you've got to think about a radio call and all that sort of stuff. So when you're starting out, just try and use VatSpy or Vatastic to find an airport that's got some staffing but there's not too much going on, and just check that out while you're learning. And don't be afraid to use text. I'll just show you very quickly. I've done it in a couple of other videos while we're taxiing in. I think it's pretty much the same for all of the different clients, but if you want to send a private message to someone, if I wanted to, I'm talking to Toronto Centre, so if I wanted to send him a text message that only he can see, whatever the call sign, whether it's an aircraft call sign or whether it's an air traffic control unit call sign, you just type in the following format: dot message space call sign, exactly as it's written. So if we wanted to send something to Toronto Centre, we would type tour _C _centre, and then a space and then the message, and then hit enter, and it will open a separate dialog box and send that to them. And that's something that a controller that I've been chatting to and working with a bit in Norway, he was really keen for me to pass that on, because not a lot of people are actually aware of that, and it's a really useful little feature if you need to send a text message. Some of them don't like it. A lot of them, in fact, if you look at the NOTAM, the ATIS for this particular centre that we're talking to now, he says don't use text. So it's always worth just checking that out. But a lot of them will accept text messages, especially if it's low workload. It's a way of communicating if you've got questions and stuff that you want asking. You can just drop them a message and just get a bit of information back from them. Sorry, I was just reading a question as well on a separate thing, but it was I thought it was relevant to this, but it was totally and utterly irrelevant. I was about to start answering it, but the person who asked me the question isn't on the stream, so it would not have been relevant or whatsoever. Cool. So as I say, it's quite a long taxi in here, but we're coming into Alpha Juliet, which is up on the right hand side, and then into the terminal. Just bringing it down to a reasonable speed. So as we turn in, we're turning into the apron, so we want to maintain around about sort of 10 knots on the apron, and then we'll start to knock off some of the lighting as we come onto the apron. So firstly, the taxi turns can go and the APU can start. So we'll start the APU there. It's a sprung loaded switch, so we'll just make sure that is engaged. Take the taxi turns off. Oh, they were never on. That's good. They should there we go. They should have been on, and they should come off when you're coming on to the apron. I think I actually knocked them off in my haste to clean the aircraft up after we vacated the runway. They should have been on all the way through the taxi. There we go. So the last thing will be, as we're coming on stand, just to knock off the taxi light so we're not blinding the marshaller. And if you're using GSX, you can go ahead and get that set up and anticipating your arrival at the gate if you want. I'm not going to bother. If I'm going to use it, I'll just get it started once we get on to stand. So we're going for Bravo 22. It's totally arbitrary guesswork at what gate they're using. I don't think, as I say, Delta actually fly that particular route, so there's no real way of finding out what routing, what gate the aircraft would have taxied into, because they don't. So there we are. We've got a docking guidance system. Just making sure we're not horrendously fast. So, parking brake is on, go to the overhead, confirm we've got the APU available. Just turn him down a bit because he's shouting again. So we put the APU on bus, and then we confirm we've got 2 blues, so the engine generators are no longer supplying electrical power. We've got 1 red, and the control switches can go to cut off. Overhead, pop the APU bleed switch on so it's providing air, and then you can release the passengers. We'll do the full hog, so we'll get GSX happening. So we'll go request deboarding. This is all part of if you want to use GSX, then you'll get familiar with how this works. And can't remember if this has got gate. Has it got a docking? Has it got any sort of? Let's have a look. Operate the jetways. Negative. So the good thing about the 737 is it comes complete with its own air stair. Oh, this one doesn't have one. That's disappointing. That's very disappointing. This particular carrier doesn't have an air stair fitted. Never mind. They'll have to live without it. So GSX is shouting at me to get the cargo doors open. It depends. I don't generally nip outside the aircraft too much after we're on the ramp. So unfortunately the passengers are going to have to leap because there's no air stair fitted and these gates aren't working. But there we go. Okay, so just the last couple of bits to do for the shutdown. We'll take the anti-collision light off. The fuel pumps will go off. The hydraulic pumps it depends if you're doing a transit shutdown or a full shutdown. We'll leave them on. We'll assume that there's another crew coming to take over. And then the last thing, if you want to go as far as going on to ground connections, you can set the wheel chocks, set the ground power, set the air conditioning, go overhead, make sure the ground power is on the bus, and that's providing the electrical power to the aircraft, and then you can knock off the APU so we're not wasting fuel. And there we go, we're on the gate and shut down, and we'll just say goodnight to control. So Delta 1485 is fully shut down at the gate. Thanks very much for your assistance. Have a good evening. I always like to just say cheers to them because I think it's just nice to appreciate the work they do. Okay, so we can disconnect from vPilot then, and we are off the network, and we're just down to our own little sim now. And the big wide world of Vatsim can no longer see us. So we're fully deboarded, and I think that probably is going to wrap up that tutorial. Let's just have a look. That's Tim. Yeah, I totally get it, mate. There's no way of breaking down a live stream, obviously, into component parts because it all happens in real time. So this is for just getting a flavour of it, I guess. I will endeavour over the next few weeks to make some videos that are more dedicated and more broken down, and I'll just start from the very bottom. I'll start with the GA stuff if you want, or I can start with just individual sections of Vatsim world related stuff. For example, I think I've already got the latest video I put up today, which was just focusing on the departure process. So check that out. And it doesn't concentrate so much on the charts and the active sky stuff and the sim brief. It concentrates more on how to compose the messages to ATC and stuff like that. But yeah, like I say, just message me, drop comments and stuff in the box, and let me know what you guys want to see, and I will absolutely put some more stuff up for you when I can over the next couple of weeks. Mike, I don't know if you're still on board. Yes, it was a pretty heavy touchdown for sure. The frame rates are absolutely crucifying me, and it is so hard to anticipate the control inputs when the frame rates are rubbish like that. But yeah, it was definitely a heavy landing. And I will look at a Tenerife video at some point. Yeah, no, it's nice to have you on board, Tim. Hopefully you got something out of it, even if it just gives you more of a taster for it. I say it feels like sitting in the real aircraft. Yeah, apart from the disastrous frame rates on finals there. But such is life; it can't be helped. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for coming along and watching. I'm going to log off and leave it there because it is now 2:15 in the morning here, and I've got to be up for work at 8. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Take it easy, guys, and I will see you very soon.